"I can teach the flower girl Eliza to speak so well in just 3 months that she can pass for a noble lady." Then Eliza arrived. The Ainsford Hills didn't recognize her as the flower girl. George Bernard Shaw was an Irish playwright, critic, polemicist and political activist. His influence on Western theatre, culture and politics extended from the 1880s to his death and beyond. He wrote more than 60 plays, including major works such as Pygmalion. With a range incorporating both contemporary satire and historical allegory, Shaw became the leading dramatist of his generation, and in 1925 was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, let's get started. One rainy night in Covent Garden, London, a crowd of people from various social classes all sought shelter under the same church portico. A wealthy mother, Mrs. Ainsford Hill, waited exasperatedly with her daughter Clara for her son Freddie to find a taxi. Freddie entered, unable to find one. Under the portico, a poor flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, sold a flower to a gentleman, Colonel Pickering. A bystander told Eliza to watch out for a strange man in the back of the crowd taking notes. Eliza thought that the man was a policeman and that she was in trouble. The man, who turned out to be Professor Henry Higgins, stepped forward and guessed where everyone was from based on their manner of speech. Everyone was confused and annoyed by the meddlesome Higgins. Eliza thought he was a policeman trying to get her in trouble and insisted that she was a good girl. Pickering asked Higgins how he could tell where everyone was from, and Higgins explained that he studied phonetics and taught people how to speak in different accents. He said, "I can teach the flower girl Eliza to speak so well in just 3 months that she can pass for a noble lady." Higgins and Pickering introduced themselves to each other. Realizing that they were familiar with each other's work, Pickering was also a linguist. The rain stopped and the crowd under the portico dispersed. Higgins and Pickering left to get dinner together. The next morning, in Higgins' laboratory, at his home, Higgins was showing all of his scientific instruments and tools for recording and studying speech to Pickering. Eliza arrived and offered to pay Higgins for speaking lessons, so that she could learn to talk more genteel, and get a better job. Higgins didn't think she could afford to pay him, and scoffed rudely at her. Pickering stepped in and bet Higgins that he couldn't teach Eliza to speak so well that she passed as a wealthy lady at an ambassador's garden party in 6 months. He offered to pay for her lessons. Higgins liked the idea and told his housekeeper Mrs. Pierce to wash Eliza and dress her in new clothes. Though Eliza protested, Eliza refused to participate in the bet, and Mrs. Pierce told Higgins not to walk over Eliza. Higgins neglected Eliza's feelings, ordering her to live with him for 6 months and take speaking lessons. Mrs. Pierce took Eliza away to talk to her in private. Meanwhile, Eliza's father, Alfred Doolittle, came to Higgins' house. He said that he hadn't seen his daughter in months, but learned of her whereabouts from the taxi driver who had brought her to the house. He asked Higgins for £5 in return for letting Eliza stay with him. Higgins and Pickering were scandalized by Mr. Doolittle's willingness to sell his daughter. While listening to him, Higgins gradually came to be so pleased with the old fellow's audacity and his unique view of morality that he gave him the £5 and was immediately rid of him. As Mr. Doolittle left, he ran into Eliza, who had washed and changed into new clothes. Mr. Doolittle called her Miss before recognizing her, getting into a fight with her, and leaving. Eliza didn't like him asking for money all the time. Mrs. Pierce entered and told Eliza that she had more clothes for her to try on. Eliza left eagerly, having seemingly accepted the offer to stay with Higgins. It was a few months later, at the home of Henry Higgins' mother, Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins was ready to have some friends over and was annoyed when Higgins barged in. because he'd been annoying her saying something crazy. Higgins told her about Eliza and said that he wanted Eliza to sit with Mrs. Higgins and her friends and try to act like a lady. Before Higgins left, some of Mrs. Higgins' friends arrived, the Ainsford Hills. Then Eliza arrived. The Ainsford Hills didn't recognize her as the flower girl. Everyone was amused with the pedantic correctness of her speech, told in perfect English. But Eliza made the mistake of talking about the death of her aunt and her father's drinking habit. Higgins came to be uneasy about her speech. Freddie seemed amused by Eliza, though Mrs. Ainsford Hill was shocked by her conversation. After Eliza left, Clara told her mother that Eliza's speech was a new, fashionable form of small talk. Clara said that manners were only a matter of habit, so there were no right or wrong ones. As the Ainsford Hills left, Freddie said, "I'd like to meet Eliza again sometime." Higgins asked his mother whether Eliza was presentable, and she said that Eliza was not. She told Higgins there was no hope for Eliza to pass as a lady. Mrs. Higgins then cautioned her son about treating Eliza like a live doll. But Pickering assured her that they took Eliza seriously. Higgins referred to Eliza as merely an experiment. Mrs. Higgins worried about what would happen to Eliza when the experiment was over. Several months later, Eliza, Higgins, and Pickering returned to Higgins' house at midnight, after a long day and night. They had gone to a garden party, followed by a dinner party, followed by the opera. Eliza successfully had passed as a wealthy lady, and Higgins had won his bet. Higgins said he was not surprised by Eliza's success and had in fact long been bored with the wager. He thanked God that the experiment was over. Eliza was offended at how the two men were speaking of her and threw Higgins' slippers at him, calling him selfish and inconsiderate. Higgins thought she was ungrateful. Eliza regained her composure and worried about what would happen to her now. Higgins suggested she marry someone wealthy, to ensure a comfortable life, but Eliza thought of this as a kind of prostitution and rejected the idea. Higgins said Pickering could get her a job in a nice florist's shop. Eliza asked whether her clothes belonged to her now, because she didn't want to be accused of stealing them. Higgins was offended by the question and told Eliza she had wounded him to the heart. Eliza went to Mrs. Higgins' house without telling him. The next day, Mrs. Higgins was sitting in her drawing room, when her parlor maid told her that Higgins and Pickering were downstairs calling the police. Mrs. Higgins told the maid to go upstairs and inform Eliza, but not to have her come down. Higgins came into the room and told his mother that Eliza had run away. Mrs. Higgins told him that Eliza had the right to leave his house whenever she wished. Pickering entered and said that he had spoken with the police about Eliza. The maid announced that a gentleman named Mr. Doolittle was at the door. Higgins didn't think that this can be Eliza's father, but it turned out to be him, dressed as a gentleman. Mr. Doolittle was upset because Higgins had mentioned his name to a wealthy American named Ezra Wannefeller, who had founded moral reform societies across the world. Higgins had joked to Wannefeller that Mr. Doolittle was England's most original moralist, and Wannefeller left Doolittle money in his will. Mr. Doolittle was angry at having been turned into a somewhat wealthy gentleman. He said his new money had brought him nothing but worries and problems and told Higgins that now he needed to be taught how to speak proper English. Mrs. Higgins told Mr. Doolittle that he could care for Eliza now. But Higgins wanted to keep Eliza at his house. Mrs. Higgins scolded Higgins and Pickering for how they had treated Eliza and revealed that Eliza was actually upstairs. Mrs. Higgins called Eliza down. She was very polite to Pickering and Higgins. Pickering was nice to Eliza, but Higgins was angry and rude to her, ordering her to come back to his house. Eliza thanked Pickering for teaching her good manners by example, and told him that her transformation had been really spurred on by when he had called her Miss Doolittle once. Eliza said that she had completely forgotten her old ways of speaking and behaving. Higgins, though, thought that she would return to her lower-class habits within weeks. Eliza finally saw her father and was shocked to hear that he was going to marry her stepmother. He asked Eliza to come to his wedding. Mrs. Higgins, Eliza, and Pickering all prepared to go to the wed. Higgins and Eliza were left alone in the room. Higgins restrained Eliza and tried to get her to return to his house. Eliza said that Higgins only wanted her back to do chores and errands for him. Higgins said that he couldn't change his rude manners toward her, because he couldn't change his nature. He explained that he was rude to everyone, not to her, just as Pickering was polite to everyone. He claimed that it was not important to have good or bad manners, but simply to behave the same way toward everyone, regardless of class. Eliza was still reluctant to go back to Higgins' house. She said that she was a slave, despite her expensive clothes. Higgins offered to adopt Eliza or marry her to Pickering. But Eliza wanted to marry Freddie Ainsford Hill, which irritated Higgins. He wanted her to marry someone of a higher class. Eliza was still angry with Higgins and told him that all she wanted was some kindness from him. She then said that if she couldn't have kindness from him, she would have her independence. She told Higgins that she would become a teacher of phonetics, stealing everything she had learned from him in order to take his clients. Higgins was suddenly impressed by Eliza's strength and confidence. Mrs. Higgins came in to take Eliza to the wedding. As she left, Higgins told Eliza to buy him some things, but Eliza told him to do it himself. Higgins alone in the room, confident that Eliza would do the errand as he asked.
Please subscribe to my channel. We're gonna show you world masterpieces in about 15 minutes with manga. Manga is Japanese-style comics that is easy for everyone to understand. We're sure that you can grasp the context shortly.
See you next time.